They said I crossed a line, kindness, that forgiveness has limits. But how can faith have limits when sin doesn't? I forgave what others buried in silence, not to protect them, but to free them.
And now, the same men who preached mercy sit before me in judgment. And they call it betrayal of the church. I call it faith, feigned, the kind that costs everything.
They said I crossed a line, that forgiveness has limits, but how can faith have limits when sin doesn't? I forgave what others buried in silence, not to protect them, but to free them. And now, the same men who preached mercy sit before me in judgment. They call it betrayal of the church. I call it faith, the kind that costs everything. My name is Father Michael Brennan, and I've served St. Augustine's Parish in Ashford, Connecticut for 17 years. I've baptized babies who grew into teenagers. I've married couples who now bring their children to Sunday Mass. I've buried grandparents, parents, and once, God help me, a child of 7 who drowned in Miller's Lake. I thought I understood the weight of my collar, the responsibility of standing between God and his people. I was wrong. The ecclesiastical court sits before me now in a conference room that smells of old wood and anxiety. Archbishop Leonard Westbrook presides from the centre, flanked by 2 canon lawyers whose faces could be carved from stone. To my left, Father Timothy Hollis, my mentor, the man who ordained me, won't meet my eyes. To my right, Monsignor Paul Dawson reviews documents with the careful attention of a man building a case for execution. Father Brennan, the Archbishop begins, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. You stand accused of violating the sacred seal of confession, of breaking the oldest trust between priest and penitent, of placing your personal judgment above 2,000 years of church law. My hands rest flat on the table before me. They're steady, though everything inside me trembles. Your Excellency, I violated nothing. I fulfilled my sacred duty. Your duty? Monsignor Dawson's voice cuts like a blade. Your duty was silence. Absolute, unbreakable silence. The seal of confession is not a suggestion, Father. It is divine law. And mercy, I ask quietly, is that also a suggestion? The Archbishop's eyes narrow. Do not lecture us on mercy, Father Brennan. We are not the ones on trial for our understanding of it. But they should be. It started 6 months ago, on a Tuesday evening in late March. The spring rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's as I sat in the confessional, the small wooden box that had witnessed thousands of sins over the decades. I heard the door open on the other side of the screen, heard the rustling of someone settling onto the kneeler. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. The voice was young, male, shaking with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief. How long has it been since your last confession, my son? 3 weeks. A pause. Father, I need to tell you something. Something I've been carrying for 5 years. I've heard many confessions in my time as a priest. Adultery, theft, violence, addiction. The human capacity for sin is vast, but so is our capacity for redemption. I thought I was prepared for anything. I'm listening, I said gently. When I was 13, the voice began, trembling now. I was in the youth group here at St. Augustine's. Coach Richards, he was in charge. Everyone loved him. Everyone trusted him. My blood went cold. He told me I was special, that God had chosen me for something important. He said it was our secret, a sacred bond. And then the voice broke. He hurt me, Father. For 2 years he hurt me, and he told me if I ever spoke about it, God would abandon me, that I'd go to hell for tempting him. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was the roaring in my ears. I'm so sorry, I whispered. My son, you bear no guilt for what was done to you. None. Do you understand me? But Father, he's still here. He's still coaching. He's still with the kids. My heart stopped. Richard Morrison was still the youth coordinator at St. Augustine's, still beloved. still trusted, still surrounded by children every Wednesday and Sunday, and I was the only one who knew the truth. What would you have done? That's the question that haunts me in the darkness, in the moments when doubt creeps in like cold water through a cracked hull. The young man, I'll call him Daniel, though that's not his real name, left the confessional that night carrying a burden slightly lighter than the one he'd brought in. But I left carrying something far heavier. The seal of confession is absolute. It's one of the oldest laws of the Catholic Church, older than nations, older than the idea of human rights as we understand them today. What is said in that wooden box stays there, protected by divine law. A priest who breaks the seal faces automatic excommunication, not suspension, not reprimand, immediate absolute separation from the Church. I knew this. God knows I knew this. But I also knew that Richard Morrison was still coaching children, still earning their trust, still creating opportunities to repeat his sins with new victims. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced my small rectory apartment, the one with the leaking faucet and the radiator that clanged like Jacob Marley's chains. I prayed until my knees ached against the hardwood floor. I begged God for guidance, for a sign, for some miraculous intervention that would solve this impossible equation. No sign came. At dawn, I called Father Timothy Hollis, the man who had been my spiritual director since seminary. His voice was rough with sleep when he answered. "Michael, it's not even 6. What's wrong?" "Tim, I need your counsel. It's urgent. Come to breakfast. 7:30. "You remember where I live?" Of course I remembered. Father Hollis lived in a small house behind St. Mary's in Hartford, the church where he'd served for 30 years. I'd spent countless hours there during my formation, learning what it meant to be a shepherd of souls. I drove through towns I'd known my whole life that morning, past the river where I learned to fish, through streets where my grandmother used to live. The landscape of memory can be comforting or haunting. Have you ever returned to a place from your childhood and found it completely changed? There's a small town between Ashford and Hartford that meant everything to me once. I'm curious, what town holds your earliest memories? Drop the name in the comments. Sometimes sharing these pieces of our past helps us understand how we became who we are. Father Hollis made eggs and toast while I sat at his kitchen table, my coffee growing cold in front of me. When I finally told him, carefully without revealing any identifying details, about the confession, his face went pale. "Michael," he said slowly, setting down his spatula, "you know what you're asking me." "I'm not asking for permission to break the seal," I said quickly. "I would never do that. But Tim, what do I do? How do I serve God when his laws seem to conflict with his mercy?" "The seal exists for a reason," Father Hollis said, sitting across from me. "Without it, people wouldn't confess. Without confession, there's no reconciliation. The sacrament depends on absolute trust." "I know that, but there is no but, Michael." His voice was gentle but firm. "You cannot act on what you learned in confession. Not directly, not ever. So I do nothing. I let it continue. You pray," he said. "You pray that the person confesses to civil authorities. You pray that God moves in the hearts of others to reveal the truth. You pray that justice finds its own way." I looked at him, this good man, this faithful priest, and I saw the same pain in his eyes that I felt in my own heart. He wasn't being callous. He was being obedient to a law that had governed our church for centuries, but obedience felt like complicity. That afternoon, I returned to St. Augustine's and sat alone in the empty sanctuary. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass, painting the pews in colors of red and gold and blue. I thought about Daniel, about the weight he'd carried for 5 years. I thought about the other children who might be carrying similar weights right now, and I made a decision that would cost me everything. I began to investigate Richard Morrison. Not as Father Michael Brennan, confessor and keeper of sacred secrets, but as Michael Brennan, human being and moral agent. I told myself there was a difference. I told myself I could separate the knowledge gained in confession from the knowledge gained through my own efforts. Looking back now, I wonder if I was lying to myself. Richard Morrison, was 47 years old. He'd been with St. Augustine's for 12 years, joining the parish the same year I was transferred there. He was single, lived alone in a modest apartment on Elm Street, and devoted almost all his free time to the youth program. Parents loved him, kids adored him. The bishop had personally commended him twice for his service to the church. I started attending youth group events. Not obviously, I'd always been present at some of them, but now I watched. Really watched. I noticed how Richard always seemed to find reasons to be alone with certain boys, how he'd put his hand on their shoulders just a bit too long, how he'd invite specific kids for mentoring sessions in his office. The patterns were there, clear as daylight, once you knew to look for them. But patterns aren't proof, and I couldn't explain how I knew to look. I began speaking with parents after Mass, casual conversations about their children's activities. How's Jake enjoying youth group? Is Tommy excited about the camping trip? Most were enthusiastic, a few were more reserved. One mother, Sarah Whitman, hesitated when I asked about her son Peter. He doesn't go anymore, she said quietly. He stopped about 6 months ago, said he didn't feel comfortable. Did he say why? She glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard in the middle of the church parking lot. Not really. But he got upset whenever we mentioned Coach Richards. We didn't push it. Teenagers, you know? I knew. I knew exactly what Peter probably wasn't saying. Mrs. Whitman, I said carefully, if Peter ever wants to talk to someone, I'm here. Not as a priest necessarily, just as someone who cares. She studied my face for a long moment. Is there something I should know, Father? I think Peter might have something to tell you, I said, and I think he needs to know that you'll believe him. She called me 2 days later. Peter had broken down and told her everything. 3 months of abuse when he was 14 during private coaching sessions. Threats, manipulation, the same pattern Daniel had described. We're going to the police, Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. But Father, how did you know? I couldn't answer that, not honestly. I've been around long enough to recognize the signs, I said instead. It wasn't entirely a lie. Will you tell the detective that there may be other victims? That they should look into Richard's history? Already done, she said. Father Michael, thank you. If you hadn't said something... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Within a week, 2 more families came forward, then 3 more. The police arrested Richard Morrison at his apartment on a Tuesday morning. The same day of the week, Daniel had come to confession. The investigation made the local news, then the state news, then national headlines. Youth coordinator at Connecticut church, charged with multiple counts of child sexual abuse. St. Augustine's parish was in chaos. Parents demanded answers. How long had this been going on? How had no one noticed? What was the church doing to prevent this from happening again? And Archbishop Westbrook called me to his office in Hartford. Father Brennan, he said, his face grave as I stood before his desk. I need to ask you a direct question, and I need a truthful answer. Did you learn about Richard Morrison's crimes through the sacrament of confession? The question hung in the air between us like a sword. I thought of Daniel. I thought of Peter. I thought of all the children who might never have spoken if I hadn't acted. Yes, I said. I did. The Archbishop closed his eyes. Then God help us both. Silence has a sound, I learned. It's the sound of institutional machinery grinding into motion, of lawyers being called, of damage control replacing pastoral care. It's the sound of a church protecting itself rather than its children. You understand what you've done? Archbishop Westbrook asked, his hands folded on his desk, in a posture I'm sure he thought conveyed calm authority. To me, it looked like a man trying to hold together something already crumbling. I understand that 6 boys have come forward. I understand that Richard Morrison is in custody. I understand that children are safer today than they were 2 weeks ago. You violated the seal of confession. His voice was quiet, but each word landed like a hammer. One of the most sacred laws of our church, the foundation of the sacrament of reconciliation. I didn't reveal what was said in confession, I said carefully. I didn't tell anyone what Daniel told me. I simply investigated independently. using information gained under the seal. Monsignor Dawson, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. Don't pass words with us, Father. You knew to investigate Richard Morrison because of what you heard in the confessional. That makes every action you took thereafter a violation. Does it? I asked. If a doctor learns that a patient has a contagious disease, is he violating confidentiality by taking precautions to protect others, not by naming the patient, but by being alert to symptoms in others? The seal of confession is not doctor-patient confidentiality, the Archbishop said sharply. It is absolute and unbreakable. The catechism is clear. Canon law is clear. 2,000 years of church teaching is clear. And the gospel? I asked quietly. Is that clear too? When Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them," when he said that anyone who causes a child to stumble would be better off with a millstone around their neck. Do not quote scripture at us to justify your disobedience, Monsignor Dawson snapped. The Archbishop raised a hand. Father Brennan, I understand the moral complexity of your situation. Truly I do. But the seal exists precisely for moments like this. It protects the penitent's right to seek forgiveness without fear of exposure. Richard Morrison wasn't the penitent, I said. Daniel was. And what about his rights? What about his need for justice, for protection? The confessional is not a police station, the Archbishop said. It is a place of divine mercy, not human justice. But aren't we called to be instruments of both? I leaned forward. Your Excellency, with all respect, we've seen what happens when the Church chooses institutional protection over the safety of children. Boston, Pennsylvania, Ireland, everywhere we've hidden behind canon law while children suffered. The room went very still. That is not what we're doing here, the Archbishop said coldly. Isn't it? I felt something breaking open inside me, years of quiet obedience cracking. You're more concerned about my violation of the seal than about the fact that a predator had access to children for 12 years, that we had him in a position of trust, that he used our church, our programs, our authority to hurt kids. We reported him to the police as soon as we knew, Monsignor Dawson said defensively. After I made it impossible not to, I said. And now you're investigating me, instead of asking how we failed to protect those children in the first place. Archbishop Westbrook stood. The meeting was ending. Father Brennan, you are suspended from all priestly duties pending a canonical investigation. You will not hear confessions. You will not say Mass. You will not present yourself as a priest in any capacity. You will move out of the rectory at St. Augustine's within 48 hours. My priesthood, my identity, my life's work, stripped away in 3 sentences. One more thing, the Archbishop said as I reached the door. The investigation will determine whether excommunication is warranted. I suggest you spend your suspension in prayer and reflection. Ask yourself if your pride has led you astray from true obedience to God. I turned back. I will pray, I said quietly, and I'll ask God the same question I'm asking you. What kind of faith protects institutions instead of children? I left before he could answer. They stripped me of everything but my conscience. The small apartment I rented was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator groaned with arthritis, the radiator hissed like a warning, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster. It was nothing like the rectory, no housekeeper bringing meals, no familiar walk to the church next door, no rhythm of daily mass and evening prayers with a community. I was alone, truly alone. Father Timothy Hollis called me the evening I moved in. Michael, I'm sorry. I wish there was something I could do. You could tell them they're wrong, I said, sitting on my one piece of furniture, a folding chair that came with the apartment. He was quiet for a long moment. I can't do that because I don't think they are wrong. Not entirely. Tim, you violated the seal, Michael. You had noble reasons, but the violation remains. And if we start making exceptions, if we say the seal is absolute except when I think the cause is important enough, then we destroy the entire foundation of the sacrament. Even if the cost of that foundation is children's safety, even then, His voice was pained, because without the seal, people won't confess. Without confession, there's no path to reconciliation. You're thinking about 6 boys who were helped. I'm thinking about millions of people who depend on the inviolable nature of the confessional. I understood his point. God help me. I even respected it, but I couldn't accept it. What would you have done? I asked. Honestly, Tim, if you'd heard what I heard? He didn't answer for so long I thought the line had gone dead. Finally, I would have suffered, as you suffered, but I would have kept the seal and let the abuse continue and trusted God to bring justice in his own way. He paused. That's what faith is, Michael. Trusting God even when we can't see the path forward, even when obedience feels like complicity. We talked for another hour, circling the same impossible questions. When we hung up, I felt more alone than before. The days blurred together. I woke without purpose, without the structure of prayers and responsibilities that had defined my life for 17 years. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, like I was speaking to an empty room. I read scripture, but the passages that once brought comfort now seem to condemn me. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. But what when both yes and no feel like betrayal? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. But what when Caesar's laws and God's laws seem to conflict? Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. But what about laying down your priesthood for children you'd never met? News of my suspension spread through the Catholic community in Connecticut like wildfire. Some priests reached out with quiet support, meeting me at coffee shops far from their parishes, where they wouldn't be seen. Others crossed the street when they saw me coming. The division was immediate and absolute. I was either a hero or a heretic, with no middle ground. The wider community was equally split. Parents of the victims called to thank me, their voices thick with gratitude and grief. Conservative Catholic blogs labeled me a traitor who'd weaponized the confessional. Canon lawyers debated my case in the Catholic press. Protestant ministers preached sermons about me, some supportive, some cautionary. I had become a symbol, which meant I'd stopped being a person. One evening, as October rain pelted my apartment windows, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Whitman, Peter's mother, stood in my doorway holding a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. "I heard you were alone," she said simply. "No one should be alone." I nearly wept at the kindness of it. She came in, and we sat at my tiny kitchen table. She told me how Peter was doing, better, seeing a therapist, slowly beginning to heal. She told me about the other families, how they were supporting each other through the investigation and trial. "Father Michael," she said as she prepared to leave, "I don't care what the church says. You saved my son. You saved all those boys. Whatever price you're paying, it wasn't for nothing." After she left, I finally cried. 3 months after my suspension, the canonical trial formally began. The Diocese of Hartford had convened an ecclesiastical court to determine my fate, not a criminal trial. The civil authorities had no jurisdiction over church law. This was something older, something that operated by rules most people didn't understand. Canon law, the legal system that had governed the Catholic Church since the Middle Ages. I was assigned a canonical advocate, a church lawyer named Margaret Reeves. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating the Byzantine corridors of church bureaucracy. "I'll be honest with you, Father Brennan," she said at our first meeting. "The case against you is airtight. You admitted to using information gained under the seal. That's the ball game. The only question is severity of punishment." "So why are we even here?" I asked. "Because sometimes the point isn't winning. It's making sure your side of the story is heard. For the record, for history." She looked at me levelly. "And because I think you're right, morally right, even if you're canonically wrong." The trial was held in a conference room that had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. Archbishop Westbrook presided, flanked by his canon lawyers. There was no jury, no public gallery, just the principals, a court recorder, and the weight of institutional judgment. The prosecution's case was simple and devastating. Monsignor Dawson presented it with prosecutorial efficiency. Canon 983, paragraph 1. The sacramental seal is inviolable. Therefore, it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way a penitent in words or in any manner and for any reason. Canon 1388, paragraph 1. A confessor who directly violates the sacramental seal incurs a late sententiae excommunication reserved to the Apostolic See. Father Brennan has admitted that he learned of Richard Morrison's crimes through the sacrament of confession. He then acted on this information, initiating an investigation that led to Morrison's arrest. By his own admission, he violated the seal. The law is clear. The penalty is clear. Margaret stood for my defense. Your Excellency, the defense does not dispute the facts as presented. Father Brennan did learn of these crimes in confession. But we argue 2 points. First, that Father Brennan did not directly reveal what was said in confession. He revealed nothing to anyone. He simply acted on knowledge that he, as a moral agent, possessed. Second, and more importantly, we must consider the context of canon law within the broader context of moral theology. The seal exists to serve mercy and reconciliation. But when maintaining the seal enables ongoing harm to the innocent, can we truly say that we're serving the gospel? The seal is absolute, Monsignor Dawson interrupted. The Catechism doesn't say absolute except in cases of abuse. The whole point of the seal is that it admits no exceptions. But church law admits exceptions in many areas, Margaret countered. Canon law recognizes the principle of epikeia, that laws may be set aside when strict adherence would violate the intent of the lawgiver. Can we truly believe that God, who commanded us to protect children, intended for the seal to protect predators? The Archbishop raised his hand for silence. Mrs. Reeves, your argument essentially asks us to weaken or eliminate the seal of confession. Do you understand the implications of that? I understand, Your Excellency, that we're asking the Church to grapple with an impossible moral dilemma. But isn't that what Christianity has always done? Wrestling with the tension between law and mercy, between tradition and justice. The debate raged for hours. Canon lawyers cited centuries of precedent. Margaret cited the gospel. Monsignor Dawson talked about the thousands of penitents who depended on the seal's inviolability. I talked about 6 boys who'd been violated while the church prioritized procedure over protection. Finally, as the afternoon light faded, the Archbishop called for a recess. We will reconvene tomorrow for witness testimony. Father Brennan, you will have the opportunity to present your moral reasoning in full. But I caution you, moral reasoning, however compelling, does not supersede canon law. That night, I prepared my testimony. Not a legal defense, but a confession of my own, of why I'd made the choice I'd made and what it had cost me, and why even now I would make it again. The next morning I took the stand in my own defense. I wore a simple black suit, not clerical garb. I was suspended, stripped of my right to present myself as a priest. But as I sat before the court, I realized the collar had never been what made me a priest. It was the calling in my heart, the burden I'd carried, the choice I'd made to protect the vulnerable, even when it cost me everything. Margaret began with simple questions. How long had I been a priest? What was my relationship with St. Augustine's parish? How did I understand the seal of confession? Then came the moment we'd prepared for. Father Brennan, she said, tell the court about the night Daniel came to you in confession. I closed my eyes, bringing back that rain-soaked evening. He was carrying a weight I could hear in his voice. When he told me what had been done to him, what Richard Morrison had done, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because I knew, immediately, I knew that this wasn't just about past sins. This was about ongoing danger. What went through your mind in that moment? Horror, grief, and responsibility. Because Daniel wasn't just confessing to me as a priest, he was reaching out as a drowning man reaches for a lifeline. And I knew that if I simply gave him absolution and sent him away, he'd drown. They'd all drown, all the children who Richard Morrison had access to. Monsignor Dawson objected. The defendant is appealing to emotion rather than addressing the legal violation. I'm appealing to the heart of what we're called to be as priests, I said, turning to face him. Yes, I knew the law. I've known it since seminary. The seal is inviolable. I've said those words in classes. I've preached about the sacred trust of confession. But that night I heard something louder than canon law. I heard Christ's words. Whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him to have a millstone hung around his neck. The Archbishop leaned forward. Father Brennan, surely you see the danger in what you're suggesting. If every priest decides for himself when the seal can be broken based on personal moral judgment, the entire sacrament collapses. Trust disappears. People stop confessing. The path to reconciliation closes. I understand that, Your Excellency. But I would ask you this. What reconciliation was I offering if I simply gave absolution while knowing that other children were being hurt? What kind of shepherd sees the wolf among his sheep and does nothing because the rules say he must maintain silence? The rules exist for a reason, Monsignor Dawson said firmly. Yes, I agreed. They exist to serve the gospel, to serve mercy and reconciliation and the salvation of souls. But when rules become ends in themselves, when we prioritize law over love, we've lost our way. We become Pharisees, straining out gnats while swallowing camels. The room went silent. I'd crossed a line, accusing the ecclesiastical court of Pharisaism. Margaret stepped in smoothly. Father Brennan, in the months since Richard Morrison's arrest, has anyone else come forward? Yes, I said. 4 more victims have contacted the police. Boys who saw the news coverage and finally felt safe enough to speak. Boys who'd been carrying their trauma in silence for years. If you had maintained the seal, would those boys have come forward? No, I said quietly. Richard Morrison would still be coaching, still earning trust, still hurting children. And those 4 boys would still be suffering in silence, believing that their pain didn't matter, that no one would believe them, that they were somehow to blame. Margaret looked at the Archbishop. Your Excellency, the defense rests on this. Father Brennan saved 10 children. He acted on information that came to him through confession, yes, but he revealed nothing. He simply opened his eyes to patterns that were always there, that we all should have seen. If that's a violation of the seal, then I would argue the seal has been misunderstood. It protects the penitent, not the predator. The Archbishop's expression was unreadable. We will adjourn for deliberation. Father Brennan, you may step down. As I returned to my seat, I caught sight of Sarah Whitman in the hallway, standing with other parents. They'd come to support me, these families I'd never met before their children were hurt. Whatever the court decided, I wasn't alone anymore. 3 days later, the court reconvened to deliver its verdict. I sat beside Margaret in the same conference room, now heavy with the weight of judgment. The Archbishop entered with his advisers, their faces revealing nothing. They'd spent 3 days in deliberation, presumably praying and debating and consulting precedent. The entire Catholic community in Connecticut, maybe beyond, was waiting to see what the Church would do with a priest who'd chosen mercy over obedience. Archbishop Westbrook opened a leather folder before him. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Father Michael Brennan, he began, his formal tone filling the space. This court has carefully considered the facts of your case, your testimony, and the broader implications of our decision. We have consulted with canon lawyers, moral theologians, and with the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. My heart hammered in my chest. The facts are not in dispute. You gained knowledge of Richard Morrison's crimes through the sacrament of confession. You then acted on that knowledge, leading to Morrison's arrest and the revelation of multiple victims. By the letter of Canon 1388, you violated the seal of confession. He paused, and I prepared myself for excommunication. However, the Archbishop continued, this court recognizes the extraordinary moral complexity of your situation. You were faced with an impossible choice: maintain the seal and allow ongoing harm, or act to protect innocent children. You chose the latter, not out of malice or disrespect for church law, but out of sincere pastoral concern. Monsignor Dawson shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, this wasn't the verdict he'd expected. After consultation and prayer, this court has determined the following. Your suspension will be lifted. You will be reinstated as a priest in good standing. However, you will be permanently removed from any position that requires hearing confessions. You may celebrate Mass, administer other sacraments, and serve in pastoral ministry, but you will never sit in a confessional again. Relief and grief hit me simultaneously. I was still a priest, but the part of priesthood I'd loved most, the intimate ministry of reconciliation, of being the vessel for God's forgiveness, was gone forever. Furthermore, the Archbishop said, the diocese will issue new guidelines for handling reports of abuse, including protocols for when information comes to light through confession. These guidelines will be developed in consultation with child safety experts and will attempt to balance the inviolability of the seal with our absolute duty to protect children. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. Father Brennan, the Archbishop said, his tone softening slightly, you put this court in an impossible position. You forced us to examine tensions in our law that we would have preferred not to confront. Many in the Church will view this verdict as too lenient. Many others will view it as too harsh. That is the nature of Solomon's judgments. Both sides leave wounded. He closed the folder. But understand this. You are being reinstated not because we condone what you did. We don't. The seal of confession remains inviolable in church law, but we recognize that you acted from conscience, from genuine love for the vulnerable, from a desire to serve the gospel. We cannot punish that motivation, even as we maintain the law you violated. What about Richard Morrison? I asked quietly. Has anyone discussed the fact that we had a predator in a position of trust for 12 years? The Archbishop's expression hardened. That is a separate matter, currently under review by another commission. But Father Brennan, do not mistake leniency for endorsement. You gambled with one of the Church's oldest and most sacred laws. The seal has protected the path to reconciliation for countless souls across centuries. The precedent you've set is dangerous, regardless of your intentions. Dangerous to whom? I asked. To predators or to children? We stared at each other across the conference table, two men serving the same God with vastly different understandings of what that service required. You're dismissed, Father Brennan, he said finally. I suggest you spend considerable time in prayer and reflection before you return to active ministry, and perhaps reflect on the fact that your interpretation of mercy is not the only one that serves God. I stood, Margaret beside me. As we left the room, I felt the weight of what I'd gained and lost. My priesthood remained, but transformed. I was a priest who could no longer hear confessions, like a surgeon who could no longer operate, a teacher who could no longer teach. But outside the building, 10 families waited, 10 children who would grow up free from the shadow of abuse, because someone had finally listened, finally acted, finally chosen them over institutional protocol. Sarah Whitman embraced me, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing us when no one else would. In that moment I knew, whatever I'd lost, it was worth it. 6 weeks later, I returned to St. Augustine's parish. Not as the pastor. Archbishop Westbrook had assigned me as an associate priest, a demotion that everyone understood. Father Raymond Cortez, transferred from a parish in New Haven, now led St. Augustine's. He was younger than me, ambitious, and careful to distance himself from my controversy. The Church had changed in my absence. Or perhaps I had changed, and now saw it differently. There was new security everywhere, cameras, badge systems, protocols for any adult working with children. The youth program had been suspended entirely, pending a complete reorganization. Parents eyed every priest with suspicion now, and who could blame them? We'd failed them. We'd put a predator in a position of trust and wrapped him in the authority of the Church. My first Sunday back, I celebrated the 10 a.m. Mass. I saw familiar faces in the pews, families I'd known for years. Some smiled with genuine warmth, others looked away. A few walked out when I approached the altar. After Mass, Mr. Peterson, whose daughter I'd baptized 15 years ago, approached me in the parking lot. He was a large man, a contractor with hands like slabs of granite. "Father Brennan," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "what you did, breaking the seal of confession. How can any of us trust you now? How do we know what we tell you in confidence will stay confidential?" "I understand your concern," I said quietly, "but I'm not permitted to hear confessions anymore. That's part of my—" "That's not the point," he interrupted. "The point is, you decided your judgment was more important than God's law. You decided you knew better than 2,000 years of church tradition. What else might you decide you know better about?" I had no answer that would satisfy him. He walked away, and I stood alone in the parking lot where I'd stood hundreds of times before, suddenly a stranger in my own parish. But there were others. Sarah Whitman organized a small gathering at her home. The families of Morrison's victims, all wanting to thank me privately. Peter, now 16, shook my hand with the firm grip of a young man finding his strength again. "Father Michael," he said, "my therapist says I'm lucky. Lucky that someone believed me. Lucky that someone acted. She says most victims never get that, so thank you for doing what was right even when it was hard." Another boy, Danny, not Daniel from confession, but another victim who'd come forward after Morrison's arrest, spoke up. "My mom says what you did was controversial, that the church is divided over it. I don't get that. You stopped a bad person from hurting more kids. How is that controversial?" Out of the mouths of babes. The months that followed were a study in contrasts. In the broader church, I remained a divisive figure. Conservative Catholic publications ran editorials condemning me as a dangerous precedent, a priest who'd weaponized the confessional. Progressive Catholic voices held me up as a hero who'd prioritized victims over institutions. Both narratives made me uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to be a hero or a revolutionary. I was trying to be a priest in the truest sense, a shepherd who protected the vulnerable. I threw myself into other forms of ministry. Hospital visits to the sick and dying, marriage preparation classes, teaching religious education to teenagers, trying to show them that faith could coexist with questions, that holiness didn't require blind obedience to corrupt systems. One evening, Father Timothy Hollis visited me. We sat in my small office at St. Augustine's, the space that used to be mine, but now felt borrowed. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said slowly. "The one where I said I would have kept the seal, that I would have trusted God to bring justice in his own way." "I remember," I said. "I was wrong, Michael." His voice cracked. Or not wrong exactly, but insufficient. I was so focused on preserving the sacrament that I forgot about preserving the children. And that's a kind of idolatry, isn't it? Making an institution more sacred than the people it's meant to serve. I felt tears prick my eyes. "Tim, you paid a terrible price for doing what was right," he continued. "You lost the ministry you loved most. You became a symbol instead of a person. You were put on trial by the very church you served, and you'd do it again, wouldn't you?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I would." He nodded slowly. "That's what makes you a better priest than most of us. Not because you broke the seal, but because you understood that the seal exists to serve mercy, not to replace it." We sat in silence for a long time, two priests wrestling with impossible questions in a church that desperately needed to ask them. A year has passed since the trial. Richard Morrison was convicted on 14 counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to 35 years in prison. All 10 victims who came forward are in therapy, healing slowly from wounds that will never fully disappear. St. Augustine's implemented new safeguarding policies that became a model for parishes throughout Connecticut. And me, I'm still here. Still a priest, though a different kind than I was before. I stand before you today not to justify what I did, but to share what I learned. Because this story isn't really about canon law or the seal of confession. It's about something far more fundamental, the cost of choosing mercy in a world that often prefers rules to righteousness. Here's what I learned, the lesson that's worth carrying forward. Faith without courage is just ritual, and courage without wisdom is just recklessness. True discipleship lives in the tension between the two. The church taught me to follow rules. Jesus taught me to follow love. When those two things conflict, and they will more often than we'd like, we must make impossible choices. There is no guidebook for moments when every path forward feels like betrayal. No easy answers when obedience to law means abandonment of mercy. What I want you to understand is this. I didn't break the seal of confession lightly. I agonized over it. I prayed until my knees bled. I consulted with mentors and begged God for another way. But in the end, I chose the children, not because I'm a hero, but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. That choice cost me. It cost me the ministry I loved. It cost me certainty and the comfort of clear-cut obedience. It cost me friendships and reputation, but it bought something more precious. 10 children's freedom from a predator, 10 families who got justice, 10 futures that weren't destroyed by silence. Was it worth it? Every single day I answer yes. But here's the harder truth. Not everyone should make the choice I made. The seal of confession is sacred for profound reasons. Without it, the path to reconciliation closes for countless people. The balance between individual good and collective good isn't simple mathematics. Sometimes protecting a sacred institution serves the greater mercy. I don't have easy answers about when to break rules for righteousness. I can't give you a formula, but I can tell you this. Pay attention to your conscience. That voice inside you that says, something is wrong here. That's often God speaking. Don't dismiss it just because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or conflicts with what you've been taught. Count the cost before you act. Courage isn't foolishness. I knew what breaking the seal would cost me, and I chose to pay that price. But I chose with open eyes. If you're going to stand against institutional power, understand that institutions fight back. Be prepared to lose everything for what you believe is right. Remember that mercy has many forms. Sometimes mercy is absolute forgiveness. Sometimes mercy is accountability. Sometimes mercy is protection. The mercy I extended to Daniel and those other boys looked like breaking silence. Your mercy might look completely different. Trust God to show you which form mercy needs to take in your circumstances. And finally, don't let anyone convince you that faithfulness equals compliance. The Pharisees were compliant. They followed every rule, dotted every theological I, crossed every legal T, and Jesus called them whitewashed tombs. Meanwhile, he broke Sabbath law to heal the sick, touched lepers in violation of purity codes, and overturned tables in the temple. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is ask whether the rules are serving the people they're meant to protect. I'm still a priest. I still believe in the church, despite everything. But I believe in a church that protects the vulnerable, that chooses children over comfort, that understands that sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is act when everyone else stays silent. They said I crossed a line. Maybe I did. But on the other side of that line were 10 children who needed someone to cross it for them. Would you have had the courage to cross it too? This story happened in Ashford, Connecticut, but it could have happened anywhere. In fact, variations of it happen every day in communities across the world, whenever someone must choose between obedience and justice. What would you have done in Father Michael's position? Have you ever faced a moment where doing the right thing meant breaking the rules? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes our stories help others find the courage to tell theirs. And if this story moved you, please share it. Not for me, but for every person who's ever had to choose between silence and speaking truth. For every child who needed someone to listen. For every conscience that struggles with impossible choices. Thank you for walking this difficult journey with me. May you have wisdom to know when to follow the rules, and courage to know when mercy demands something more. Touching stories.